Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a case file waiting to be reopened. Amelia Earhart was more than just a pilot. She was a symbol of daring ambition, a woman who defied the odds and set her sights on the impossible. In 1937, she set out to circumnavigate the globe, chasing a dream that had captured the imagination of millions. But somewhere over the vast Pacific, she vanished. No wreckage, no trace, no answers, just questions that have lingered for nearly a century. What happened to Amelia Earhart? Was it a tragic accident, a secret mission gone wrong, or something stranger? This is her story. The rise, the flight, and the mystery that endures. Amelia Mary Earhart's story begins far from the skies. She would one day conquer. Born in Atchison, Kansas, in 1897, she grew up in an America still defining itself in the modern age. Airplanes had barely taken flight when Amelia was a child, yet her imagination already reached for them. Her childhood wasn't the storybook picture of privilege. Her father, an attorney, battled alcoholism, and the family often moved, never quite rooted. But in Amelia's restless spirit, the instability seemed only to plant the seeds of curiosity and independence. She was a tomboy in the most defiant sense of the word, climbing trees, shooting rats with a rifle, and collecting newspaper clippings of women who had achieved unusual feats. Long before she ever set foot in a cockpit, Amelia was charting a course for herself against the winds of convention. Her first encounter with airplanes wasn't love at first sight. At a state fair when she was just a child, she saw a flying machine sputtering overhead. Rather than being dazzled, she dismissed it as unimpressive, more curiosity than marvel. But fate had a way of circling back. In 1920, at the age of 23, Amelia attended an air show in Long Beach, California. For a small fee, she climbed into the passenger seat of Frank Hawks's biplane. The flight lasted only a few minutes, but Amelia later recalled that the moment they left the ground, she knew she had to fly. By the time I had got 200 or 300 feet off the ground, she said, I knew I had to fly. The spark had ignited. From that moment, Amelia threw herself into aviation. She worked odd jobs, truck driver, photographer, stenographer, saving every dollar for flying lessons. Her instructor was Netta Snook, one of the few female pilots of the era, who taught Amelia not only the mechanics of flight, but also the resolve to survive in a world dominated by men. By 1921, Amelia purchased her first plane, a bright yellow Kinner Airster biplane she nicknamed the Canary. It was with this machine that she began breaking records, setting the stage for her career. In 1922, she flew to an altitude of 14,000 feet, setting a women's world record. She was no longer a woman who admired daring feats. She was becoming the woman others admired. The 1920s were a time of aviation's rapid rise. Charles Lindbergh had electrified the world in 1927 with his solo non-stop flight across the Atlantic, and the public appetite for stories of conquest in the sky was insatiable. Amelia stepped into that world at the perfect time. With her short-cropped hair, slim figure, and quiet confidence, she was dubbed Lady Lindy, the female counterpart to Lindbergh. Yet Amelia was more than a reflection of another man's achievement. She was her own phenomenon, someone who embodied both glamour and grit. Her growing reputation caught the attention of promoters, journalists, and powerful supporters who believed a woman crossing the Atlantic would captivate the public imagination. In 1928, Amelia achieved global fame when she became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. Technically, she was a passenger piloted by Wilma Stoltz and Louis Gordon, but the headlines read differently. Amelia Earhart Flies the Atlantic was enough to transform her life. She was given ticker tape parades in New York, honored by President Calvin Coolidge, and suddenly thrust into the role of international celebrity. She wrote a book about the flight, began lecturing across the country, and signed endorsements that brought her both money and fame. But the role of celebrity aviatrix was not enough for Amelia. She knew the whispers that she hadn't really piloted the flight, that she was just a mascot. She wanted more. Amelia Earhart wasn't satisfied being a passenger in her own story. She became determined to make her mark as a true pilot, not just a figurehead. In 1932, she silenced critics once and for all when she piloted her Lockheed Vega 5B solo across the Atlantic. She flew from Newfoundland to Northern Ireland in a harrowing 15-hour journey, battling icy winds, mechanical troubles, and exhaustion. When she landed in a farmer's field in Culmore, she became the first woman and only the second person after Lindbergh to accomplish the feat. For that achievement, she earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, the first woman ever to do so. It was a triumph not just of skill but of persistence. Her records piled up in the years that followed. She flew solo non-stop across the United States, from Los Angeles to Newark. She set new speed and distance records, each flight another notch in a legacy she was consciously building. Amelia also became a powerful advocate for women in aviation, helping found the 99s, an international organization of female pilots that still exists today. To Amelia, flying was not just a personal passion, but a political act. Each takeoff and landing was a statement that women could match men in courage, skill, and determination. Yet Amelia's legend was not only crafted in the air. On the ground, she carefully managed her image with the help of publisher and publicist George Putnam, who would later become her husband. She appeared on lecture tours, signed autographs, posed for photographs, and published books that blended her adventures with inspiration. She had become a brand, one of the first of her kind, an aviator whose name was known across continents. Earhart was not merely a pilot. She was a symbol of possibility in a world both enchanted and unsettled by rapid change. By the mid-1930s, Amelia Earhart was a household name. Her flights were front-page news, her face appeared in advertisements, and her voice inspired young women to step beyond traditional roles. She was not just flying, she was leading a cultural movement, soaring above expectations and planting her flag firmly in history. She had conquered the skies, but Amelia's gaze was fixed on a new horizon. The globe itself, she decided, would be her next great frontier. By the mid-1930s, Amelia Earhart was not only a legend in the air, but a cultural icon on the ground. She had crossed oceans, spanned continents, and defied skeptics who once dismissed her as a novelty act. Yet for all her accomplishments, Amelia was restless. To her, records were not just meant to be broken, but to be expanded into the unknown. She had flown solo across the Atlantic, across the United States, and over vast distances that left others trembling. But there was one feat left, the grandest of them all, to circle the entire globe. The idea of flying around the world was not entirely new. A handful of aviators had already managed it, though often in stages with heavy military backing or specialized aircraft. But Amelia's plan was different. She would attempt to become the first woman to circumnavigate the globe by air, flying close to the equator, a route longer and more perilous than any taken before. In her mind, this wasn't just about personal glory. It was about pushing aviation itself forward, showing what human ingenuity and courage could achieve at a time when air travel was still in its infancy. Behind every daring idea, though, was the practical problem of financing it. Amelia's fame made her a household name, but fame didn't pay for fuel, mechanics, and aircraft. Enter George Putnam, her husband and publicist, who understood how to turn Amelia's vision into a story the world couldn't resist. Sponsors were courted, media deals were arranged, and the narrative of the first woman to fly around the world was set in motion. For companies, supporting Earhart wasn't just about adventure. It was about attaching their brands to progress, modernity, and courage. Amelia herself was deeply involved in these preparations, aware that her life's work was as much about inspiration as it was about aviation. The aircraft chosen for the mission was the Lockheed Electra 10E, a sleek twin-engine plane designed for long-range flights, outfitted with additional fuel tanks, advanced radio equipment, and carefully measured supplies. It was a marvel of engineering for its time. But even the best machines couldn't guarantee success. The Electra would be tested in ways no one could fully predict. It would have to endure storms, unpredictable winds, and stretches of ocean so vast that one mistake could mean vanishing forever. Just as important as the aircraft was the navigator. Amelia selected Fred Noonan, a highly experienced navigator who had cut his teeth flying routes across the Pacific for Pan American Airways. Noonan's skills in celestial navigation were considered among the best in the world, and his calm professionalism balanced Amelia's daring. Together, they formed a team that could combine her fearless flying with his ability to chart paths across featureless waters. If anyone could make the impossible journey work, it was this duo. The planned route was audacious. From the United States, Amelia and Noonan would cross the Caribbean, South America, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, before tackling the vast and treacherous Pacific. Nearly 29,000 miles in all, the journey would hug the equator, making it longer than most previous circumnavigations. For Amelia, this wasn't just a flight. It was a statement. It said that the world was shrinking, that humans could connect continents in days rather than weeks, and that women could stand at the forefront of that revolution. Of course, the risks loomed large. Aviation in the 1930s was still riddled with uncertainties. Weather forecasts were often little more than educated guesses. Navigation over oceans was a nerve-wracking blend of dead reckoning, celestial observations, and fragile radio signals. Amelia knew the dangers. She had lost friends and colleagues to crashes, and she understood that the sky was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Yet her determination only grew sharper in the face of these risks. She believed that progress required courage, and courage often demanded sacrifice. Amelia also carried the weight of symbolism. She wasn't just flying for herself, she was flying for women everywhere. Her speeches, writings, and public persona had long emphasized that women were capable of greatness in fields dominated by men. The circumnavigation was more than a record, it was an act of defiance against limitations. If she could fly around the world, what couldn't women do? In this sense, her flight was both personal and political, both daring and deeply symbolic. By late 1936, the plans were finalized. The Electra was ready, the crew assembled, and the world's attention drawn once more to Amelia Earhart. Newspapers framed her mission as the adventure of a lifetime, while aviation enthusiasts marveled at the technical challenges ahead. For Amelia, the excitement was tempered with seriousness. She kept meticulous notes, studied navigation charts, and trained tirelessly for the journey. Her calm voice in interviews belied the enormous weight she carried, both the dream of conquest and the shadow of risk. As the start date approached, anticipation built like the hush before a storm. Amelia Earhart, already a legend, was about to attempt a flight that would either crown her as the greatest aviator of her time, or silence her story in the endless expanse of the sky. The dream of circumnavigation wasn't just about flying around the world, it was about rewriting the boundaries of what humanity believed possible. And for Amelia, it was about etching her name in the heavens one final time. The dream of circling the globe was bold, but like all great ambitions, it met resistance in reality. By early 1937, Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra 10E was prepared for its maiden attempt at circumnavigation. The world waited in anticipation. Newspapers carried headlines, and Amelia herself stood at the center of attention, poised to achieve what no woman and few men had ever dared. Yet, fate is rarely kind to pioneers. The first attempt would not only falter, but nearly cost Amelia her life. The initial plan was to fly westward. Amelia and her team envisioned a route from California across the Pacific to Hawaii, then onward through Asia, the Middle East, Africa, South America, and finally back to the United States. It was a logical direction, following the trade winds and testing the plane early over stretches of ocean with better access to American support bases. The flight began in March 1937, and with Amelia at the controls and Fred Noonan as navigator, the world looked on with breath held. The first legs went smoothly enough. Earhart's Electra carried her from Oakland, California, to Honolulu, Hawaii. Crowds greeted her there with enthusiasm, and the press marveled at her cool professionalism. Amelia herself seemed calm, though aware of the challenge ahead. Hawaii was just the beginning. The true trials lay in the vast Pacific beyond. The next leg was the most dangerous yet, a grueling, nearly 600-mile flight from Honolulu to tiny Howland Island, a speck of land in an unforgiving sea. But before Amelia could even attempt that perilous stretch, disaster struck. On March 20th, 1937, Amelia and her crew prepared to take off from Luke Field on Ford Island, Honolulu. The Electra had been loaded heavily with fuel, straining under the weight but ready for the long journey. As Amelia began her takeoff roll, the plane veered sharply to the right. Witnesses later described the Electra skidding wildly across the runway, its landing gear collapsing, one wing scraping the ground. Sparks flew, metal screeched, and the plane lurched violently before finally grinding to a halt. Miraculously, no one was seriously injured, but the aircraft was badly damaged. The cause of the crash has been debated ever since. Some claimed it was due to a burst tire, others suggested a miscalculation with the heavy fuel load, and still others blamed pilot error. Amelia herself was quiet on the matter, preferring not to dwell on what could easily have been her last flight. What mattered was that the Electra was crippled, its wing was torn, the landing gear smashed, and the aircraft was in no condition to continue. For Amelia, who had built her reputation on confidence and skill, it was a humiliating blow. The accident forced her to ship the plane back to Lockheed's Burbank facility for repairs. The setback was costly in both time and money, and skeptics began to whisper, had Amelia bitten off more than she could chew? Was this ambitious journey doomed from the start? Critics who had long dismissed female aviators as publicity stunts found new fuel for their arguments. Yet Amelia remained undeterred. She saw the accident not as an ending but as a temporary delay. Courage, she once wrote, is the price that life exacts for granting peace. If anything, the failure deepened her resolve. During the downtime, Amelia regrouped. Repairs were made to the Electra, and she reassessed her strategy. The westward route, though logical, carried its own dangers. The long Pacific hops were nerve-wracking, and Amelia now considered an alternate approach. If she reversed the route and flew eastward, she could cover more of the journey over land, leaving the longest and most dangerous ocean stretch, the Pacific, for the very end. It was a bold adjustment, but it offered at least the chance of incremental progress. The incident in Hawaii also reinforced the importance of precision. Amelia's fame often drew comparisons to entertainers, but in truth she was a disciplined aviator who studied her craft carefully. She knew that to succeed, she and Noonan would need not only skill but also flawless coordination. Navigation over land was one thing. Over open ocean, it was a different world entirely. The smallest error in calculation could mean missing an island target by hundreds of miles. Amelia placed her trust in Noonan's navigation, while also training herself to better handle the Electra under extreme conditions. What is striking about this episode in Amelia's story is not just the accident, but her reaction to it. For many, the crash at Luke Field would have been a career-ending moment. Headlines could have shifted from admiration to ridicule, and the dream of circumnavigation might have quietly died. But Amelia was not wired for surrender. To her, every failure was fuel for persistence. She understood that risk was the price of greatness, and she wore that reality as part of her identity. By the time the Electra was repaired and plans were redrawn, Amelia was ready to try again. The first attempt, though it ended in disaster, had not broken her spirit, it had steeled it. If anything, the failed takeoff in Hawaii revealed the resilience that made Amelia Earhart more than just a celebrity. She was a pilot who knew that the sky owed her nothing, and that every inch of progress had to be fought for. The setback was painful, costly, and public, but it was not the end. It was only the prelude to the final, fateful journey. When Amelia Earhart prepared to launch her second attempt at circumnavigation, the air was thick with anticipation and determination. The crash at Luke Field in Hawaii had left scars on her Electra, on her finances, and on her reputation, but not on her resolve. For Amelia, the dream of flying around the world was more than a personal goal. It was a test of endurance, courage, and vision, and she was unwilling to let one disastrous setback rewrite her story. By May of 1937, the Lockheed Electra was fully repaired, gleaming once more with polished aluminum skin, and fortified against the grueling journey ahead. This time, the route would be reversed. Instead of heading westward into the uncertainty of the Pacific as the opening act, Amelia decided to fly eastward. The logic was practical. By moving east, much of the early journey would be over land or shorter sea legs, which meant that if anything went wrong, there was at least a better chance of making an emergency landing. It was also psychologically strategic. The most dangerous stretch crossing the wide Pacific would come at the end, when Amelia and Fred Noonan would be seasoned with thousands of miles of flight behind them. On May 20th, 1937, Amelia and Noonan departed from Oakland, California, bound for Miami. The Electra, now loaded with auxiliary fuel tanks and supplies, seemed to carry not just two aviators, but the weight of the world's expectations. Their arrival in Miami was met with cheers, headlines, and fresh excitement. The Miami Herald published front-page stories, calling her mission the flight that will make or break aviation history. Amelia herself maintained her usual composure, neither boastful nor fearful, but clearly aware that every move she made was being watched by millions. From Miami, the journey truly began. The Electra lifted off and carried them down the spine of South America. They flew across the Caribbean, where the turquoise waters shimmered beneath them, and landed in places where curious crowds gathered just to glimpse the famous aviatrix. In South America, they stopped in Natal, Brazil, the easternmost tip of the continent, a place where the land seems to stretch its hand toward Africa. Amelia recorded her impressions with characteristic understatement, writing in her log about weather, equipment, and navigation, as though the enormity of the challenge was just another day at work. Crossing the Atlantic was a trial in itself. Though not as long as her solo flight in 1932, the route from Natal to Africa still tested both plane and crew. Hours passed with only endless ocean below. Navigation depended on Fred Noonan's expertise with sextant readings and radio bearings, while Amelia focused on keeping the Electra steady. When the coast of Africa finally emerged, the relief must have been palpable. They landed in Dakar, Senegal, greeted by astonished locals and international reporters who followed every step of her progress. From there, the flight turned into a grand tour of continents. Across North Africa, Amelia flew over deserts, shimmering with heat waves, where tiny oases dotted the sand like emeralds. She crossed the Nile, past ancient cities steeped in history, and then traced her way through the Middle East. Stops included Khartoum in Sudan, where the white and blue Nile converged, and Karachi in British India, where colonial officials treated her like a visiting dignitary. To Amelia, these were not tourist attractions but milestones in her journey, each landing strip another tick closer to her dream. Her journey also highlighted the shifting boundaries of a world on the brink of change. In Africa and Asia, colonial empires still held sway, their flags flying above airstrips that seemed to belong as much to adventurers as to soldiers. Amelia moved gracefully through these intersections of culture and power, her fame smoothing the way in places where few Western women had traveled alone, let alone in command of an aircraft. Yet beneath the courtesies lay the strain of constant flying exhaustion, mechanical checks, weather worries, and the endless vigilance that long-distance aviation required. By the time the Electra reached Southeast Asia, Amelia and Noonan had already logged thousands of miles. They had flown across Africa, threaded through Arabia, and pushed eastward across India and Burma, where the monsoon season brought sheets of rain and turbulence that tested their endurance. The Electra roared through storm clouds, its engines straining against buffeting winds, while Amelia's hands gripped the controls with quiet determination. Each safe landing felt like a small victory. Their journey took them next to the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, where lush islands rose out of tropical seas. Stops in places like Bandoeng and Surabaya reminded them of how far they had come, but also how far they had yet to go. The Pacific still loomed ahead, the final and most dangerous chapter of the flight, but Amelia remained focused. To reporters, she downplayed the risks, offering only simple comments about progress and weather. Beneath the calm surface, however, she knew what awaited: a long, lonely ocean where islands were as small as pinpricks on a map. By June 29, 1937, Amelia and Fred reached Lae, New Guinea. They had covered more than 22,000 miles of the planned 29,000. The world applauded their achievement thus far. Newspapers called it a triumph, a prelude to certain success. Yet Amelia was not careless with optimism. She knew the most treacherous leg lay just ahead, the flight from Lae to Howland Island, a 500-mile journey across featureless ocean, to a speck of land only 2 miles wide. If their navigation was off by even a fraction, they would miss it entirely. The second attempt had brought them further than ever before, but fate, as always, was waiting in the skies. By the time Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan touched down in Lae, New Guinea on June 29, 1937, they had already achieved what most would consider impossible. 22,000 miles lay behind them, continents crossed, oceans spanned, storms weathered, yet the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. Only about 7,000 miles remained, but those miles stretched across the vast and merciless Pacific, where a single error could erase them into silence. The next leg of the journey, Lae to Howland Island, was the most dangerous of all. Howland was little more than a scrap of land in the middle of endless blue, barely 2 miles long and a half-mile wide. It was a dot on the map, a speck surrounded by thousands of miles of open sea. For Amelia and Fred, finding it would require extraordinary precision in navigation. Even for Noonan, one of the best navigators in the world, this was no simple task. Celestial navigation depended on clear skies, and weather forecasts were unreliable. Radio communication would have to bridge the distance between Amelia's Electra and the U.S. Coast Guard cutter, Itasca, stationed at Howland to guide them in. The margin for error was razor thin. The preparations in Lae were careful but hurried. Mechanics checked the Electra, fuel tanks were filled to capacity, and supplies were loaded. Amelia, ever the calm professional, showed no outward signs of nerves, though she confided to friends that she was tired. The strain of weeks in the air, long days of flying, and the constant focus on detail weighed heavily. But Amelia was not one to show doubt. She posed for photographs, smiled for reporters, and wrote her final letters with a matter-of-fact tone that belied the peril ahead. On the morning of July 2nd, 1937, Amelia and Fred lifted off from Lae. The Electra roared down the runway, engines straining under the heavy load of fuel. As the plane climbed into the cloudy skies, those who watched waved, unaware they were witnessing her last confirmed takeoff. For Amelia and Fred, the world quickly shrank into an endless horizon of water, cloud and hope. The first hours of the flight were steady, though not without challenges. Radio operators in La picked up Amelia's transmissions reporting heavy cloud cover and difficulty in maintaining accurate navigation readings. She mentioned being on course, but fighting headwinds stronger than expected. For long stretches, her voice faded into static, barely audible against the crackle of weak radio signals. This was the reality of 1930s aviation: fragile technology, inconsistent communication, and pilots relying on a mix of instinct and calculation. As the Electra pressed deeper into the Pacific, the Itasca waited anxiously near Howland Island. The Coast Guard crew had set up radio transmissions, guiding signals, and smoke markers to help Amelia home in on their position. But almost immediately, communication problems surfaced. Amelia's equipment struggled to receive signals properly, and the Itasca crew couldn't always hear her clearly. Static interfered, frequencies were mismatched, and crucial instructions never connected. Hours ticked by, and tension mounted. Amelia's reports grew more urgent. At one point she radioed that her fuel was running low, and that she was uncertain of her position. She believed she was near Howland, but the tiny island remained invisible against the vast ocean backdrop. The Itasca sent frantic responses, but if Amelia heard them, she gave no indication. Radio silence fell again and again, only to be broken by fragments of her voice, carrying both resolve and strain. Then came the words that would echo through history. "We are on the line, 157, 337. We are running north and south." This final confirmed transmission indicated that Amelia and Fred were flying along a navigational line they believed passed near Howland. They searched desperately, tracing back and forth, hoping to spot the island or see smoke from the Itasca. But the ocean revealed nothing. The sky gave no landmarks, only haze and horizon. And then, silence. Amelia's voice disappeared from the airwaves, and the Electra from the sky. For the men aboard the Itasca, the silence was unbearable. They strained at radios, scanned the horizon, and searched for signs of her plane, but none came. The Electra had simply vanished. The ship sent distress calls, launched search efforts, and alerted the Navy. Within hours, the largest air and sea search in US history was underway, combing thousands of square miles of ocean. But no wreckage was found. No floating debris, no oil slick, no parachutes. It was as though the sea had swallowed Amelia Earhart whole. The disappearance stunned the world. Headlines screamed across newspapers, "Amelia Earhart missing." Crowds gathered outside radio stations hoping for updates. For days, hope lingered that she might be found, stranded on some remote island, waiting for rescue. But as days turned to weeks, the hope dimmed. The Pacific had claimed its mystery, and Amelia's fate became one of history's most haunting questions. For Amelia herself, the final leg was the ultimate paradox. She had conquered the skies, flown further and higher than any woman before her, and come within reach of completing her dream. Yet it was here, on the brink of triumph, that she disappeared. In the end, the flight from Leh to Howland wasn't just the last leg of her journey. It was the point at which legend overtook life, and Amelia Earhart passed forever into mystery. The morning of July 2nd, 1937, gave way to a silence that the world has never fully shaken. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan had taken off from Leh, New Guinea, with determination, discipline, and hope. They had charted their course, fueled the Electra, and put their trust in the fragile threads of radio communication and navigational skill. But somewhere along the endless Pacific expanse, the threads snapped. What happened in those final hours remains one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. The official record begins with fragments of communication. Early in the flight, Amelia reported cloud cover and difficulty maintaining her planned course. She struggled to pick up the guiding signals from the US Coast Guard cutter, Itasca, stationed off Howland Island, to act as their beacon. The Electra's radio, though state-of-the-art for its time, was temperamental. It was known to transmit powerfully, but often had difficulty receiving. That imbalance meant Amelia's voice carried across the waves, but she might not have heard a single word in reply. By the time her transmissions grew urgent, the Itasca crew was frantic. Radio logs described messages filled with static, Amelia's voice fading in and out like a ghost. "We must be on you but cannot see you," she declared at one point, a line that captured the agony of her final hours. Imagine flying thousands of miles across open ocean, knowing that your life depends on spotting a strip of land no wider than a city block, and finding nothing. Every minute without sighting the island meant fuel was dwindling. options narrowing and survival slipping away. The Itasca responded desperately, broadcasting signals, setting off smoke plumes, and even firing up boilers to create massive smoke clouds as a visual marker. But if Amelia and Fred were close, they did not see it. Perhaps haze obscured the horizon. Perhaps their course was off by only a few degrees, enough to miss Howland entirely. The Pacific is merciless that way. A single miscalculation of even a few nautical miles could send a plane hopelessly astray, with no landmarks to correct the error. Then came the final confirmed message. We are on the line 157, 337. We are running north and south. To navigators, this meant Amelia and Noonan were flying along a line of position, a straight navigational line they believed intersected Howland Island. By tracing north and south along that invisible path, they hoped to cross the island itself, but the ocean is vast, and Howland was unforgivingly small. After that message, the airwaves fell silent. No further words were heard from Amelia Earhart. The moment marked the vanishing point, not just for the flight, but for Amelia's presence in the world. Within hours, panic rippled through the Itasca. Messages were sent to the US Navy. Ships and aircraft were dispatched from Pearl Harbor, combing an enormous swath of the Pacific. For 2 weeks, searchers scoured nearly 250,000 square miles of ocean, looking for wreckage, rafts, or signals. Pilots dipped low over scattered islands, straining their eyes for signs of a crash landing. Radio operators tuned their equipment, hoping to catch even the faintest whisper of Amelia's voice. There were rumors. Faint signals picked up by amateur radio operators, strange transmissions that some claimed came from Earhart herself. One operator in Florida swore she heard a weak female voice calling for help, while another in Texas reported similar fragments. For days, newspapers ran with these stories, giving families hope that Amelia and Fred were alive, stranded but reaching out. But none of the signals were ever confirmed, and in time they were dismissed as atmospheric interference, coincidences, or wishful thinking. By mid-July, the US government reluctantly scaled back the search. No debris, no survivors, no trace had been found. For the first time in her career, Amelia Earhart had disappeared from the public's gaze, not in a triumphant landing or a new record, but in silence. The Itasca returned to port. The Navy shifted its attention elsewhere. Officially, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were declared lost at sea, their Electra believed to have run out of fuel and plunged into the ocean. But the absence of evidence became fertile ground for speculation. People could not accept that Amelia, who had defied gravity and expectations, had simply vanished into the waves. The Pacific, vast as it was, seemed incapable of erasing such a figure without leaving something behind. The void left by her disappearance became a canvas for theories, conspiracies, and legends that continue to this day. What is most haunting about the vanishing point is its simplicity. No dramatic explosion, no fiery crash, no eyewitnesses, just silence. One moment, Amelia's voice crackled through the static, resolute but strained. The next, there was nothing but the hiss of radio static and the rolling waves of the Pacific. In that gap between sound and silence, history's most enduring mystery was born. For those who knew her, the silence was unbearable. George Putnam, her husband, refused to accept her loss immediately. Friends and fellow aviators clung to the hope that she might yet be found on some remote island. The public, who had cheered her flights and embraced her as a symbol of progress, now grieved as though they had lost a member of their own family. And in a sense, they had. Amelia Earhart had belonged to the world, and the world now faced the cruel truth that she was gone. The vanishing point was not just the end of a flight. It was the beginning of a legend, a mystery that would outlive every witness, every searcher, every theory. Amelia Earhart had taken off into the skies, and somewhere over the Pacific, she disappeared. Yet in disappearing, she became eternal, a figure forever caught between the known and the unknown, the real and the myth. In the wake of Amelia Earhart's disappearance, theories rushed in like tides against a restless shore. Friends, fans, and experts searched for answers, but the US government leaned toward one explanation above all others, that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan simply ran out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific near Howland Island. Known as the crash and sink theory, it became the official narrative, supported by naval reports, aviation experts, and the absence of any conclusive evidence pointing elsewhere. But like all theories surrounding Amelia, even this simple explanation was layered with uncertainties and controversy. The logic behind crash and sink begins with Amelia's last confirmed transmissions. Her words to the Itasca indicated that she was near Howland Island, but unable to see it. She reported being low on fuel, flying along the line of position 157, 337, running north and south in hopes of spotting land. For many experts, this suggests that Amelia and Fred were close to Howland, but just far enough off course to miss it. With the Electra's tanks running dry, the inevitable outcome was a forced ditching at sea. Supporters of the theory argue that it aligns with known facts. Amelia had been flying for more than 20 hours. Headwinds were stronger than forecasted, consuming more fuel than planned. Communication breakdowns meant she could not reliably home in on the Itasca's signals. Navigational errors, even small ones, compounded over thousands of miles, could have put her dozens of miles off target, more than enough to make Howland vanish beyond the horizon. With no land in sight, no signals received, and fuel nearly gone, Amelia likely flew until the engines sputtered out and the Electra descended into the Pacific. The US Navy, after its massive search in July 1937, leaned heavily on this conclusion. Ships and planes scoured the waters near Howland and Baker Islands, dropping markers, searching for oil slicks, and looking for wreckage. Despite covering nearly 250,000 square miles of ocean, they found nothing. Yet officials concluded that the most likely scenario was that the plane had sunk quickly, leaving little trace. The Pacific, after all, is an unforgiving graveyard. Wreckage could sink within minutes, disappearing into depths of 18,000 feet or more. Once submerged, the Electra might rest hidden in the dark, out of human reach. To this day, the crash and sink theory remains the most widely accepted explanation among many historians and aviation experts. It is straightforward, consistent with Amelia's radio calls, and supported by the lack of evidence elsewhere. If one strips away the allure of mystery, the simplest answer may be the truest. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan perished at sea, victims of bad luck, imperfect navigation, and the limits of 1930s technology. But simplicity has never satisfied the human imagination. Skeptics point out that the Navy's search, while vast, may not have covered the exact area where Amelia's Electra went down. Ocean currents could have carried debris far from the crash site before it was spotted. Others question why not a single scrap of the Electra, no floating wreckage, no trace of oil, was ever definitively found. In the decades since, sonar scans, deep-sea searches, and modern expeditions have hunted for the Electra's remains on the seafloor, but nothing conclusive has surfaced. If the plane sank, it remains hidden in one of the ocean's deepest, most remote regions. There is also the matter of Amelia's reported distress calls. In the days following her disappearance, amateur radio operators claimed to have picked up weak signals on Earhart's known frequencies. Some described hearing a woman's voice, faint but urgent, pleading for help. If the Electra had sunk, how could such signals exist? Supporters of crash and sink dismiss these as misinterpretations, atmospheric distortions, or even hoaxes. Yet for others, the possibility of those signals suggests Amelia may have survived the flight a little longer, stranded somewhere other than the sea. Still, the crash and sink theory holds a kind of tragic logic. Amelia had risked everything on the razor-thin chance of finding Howland Island, a speck on a map in the middle of nowhere. The odds were stacked against her, and even with Fred Noonan's skill, the smallest navigational slip could mean death. Pilots who attempted similar flights later acknowledged just how impossible the task truly was, even with better equipment. In many ways, Amelia was pushing the edge of what was humanly possible, and sometimes the edge wins. The haunting power of the crash and sink theory lies in its quiet inevitability. There was no conspiracy, no hidden imprisonment, no survival on a distant island, just a slow, steady slide into the sea. Amelia's final minutes, in this version, were spent scanning the horizon for land that never appeared, her voice growing weaker on the radio, her eyes searching the waves until fuel was gone. The Electra, engines sputtering, dipped toward the ocean, and then vanished beneath its surface. No drama, no survival, just silence and water. And yet, despite the official conclusion, the human mind resists. We are not comfortable with heroes simply vanishing into nothingness. Perhaps that is why, though crash and sink may be the most plausible explanation, it has never captured the public imagination the way other theories have. For some it feels too ordinary, too anticlimactic, for a woman who lived such an extraordinary life. Amelia Earhart was larger than life. Surely her end too must be something more. Still, crash and sink remains the baseline against which every other theory is measured. If Amelia did not end at sea, then where did she go? The absence of wreckage has fueled other possibilities. Ones that pull her story from the depths of tragedy into the realms of mystery, survival, and conspiracy. The vanishing point, after all, left no proof, only silence. And in that silence, speculation thrives. If the crash and sink theory offered a tidy explanation, the Nikomaroro hypothesis unraveled it with tantalizing fragments of evidence. For decades, many believed Amelia Earhart had vanished beneath the Pacific waves, but others argued she may have survived the flight, at least for a time, by landing on a remote island, then called Gardner Island, now known as Nikomaroro. This desolate coral atoll, part of the Phoenix Islands in present-day Kiribati, lies about 350 miles southeast of Howland. It was uninhabited, isolated, and surrounded by treacherous reefs, but to some, it represented a plausible alternate ending to Earhart's journey, an ending marked not by an instant crash but by days, perhaps weeks of survival. The theory first emerged in the years immediately after Amelia's disappearance. If she had missed Howland, supporters argued, she and Fred Noonan might have turned south along their last reported navigational line, searching for any landfall. On that line lay Nikomaro, to the U.S. Navy, which conducted aerial searches over the island during their initial sweep. It was just another speck in a chain of barren atolls. Pilots reported seeing signs of recent habitation, though the island was known to be uninhabited, but the Navy dismissed the clue and moved on. For decades, it was little more than a footnote. Then, in 1940, the mystery deepened. British colonial authorities exploring Nikomaro discovered skeletal remains near the shoreline, along with a sextant box, a woman's shoe and other artifacts. The bones were sent to Fiji for analysis. At the time, a physician concluded they belonged to a European male, and the case was dropped. But decades later, modern re-examinations of the records suggested otherwise. Some researchers argued the skeletal measurements were more consistent with a tall woman of European descent, someone very much like Amelia Earhart. The bones themselves were lost, leaving only the notes behind, but the speculation grew. The International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery (TIRE), an organization dedicated to solving aviation mysteries, took up the Nikomaroro hypothesis in the late 20th century. Through multiple expeditions, they uncovered a collection of artifacts that seemed eerily suggestive, pieces of aluminum sheeting, believed by some to match the Electra's construction, a fragment of plexiglass, similar to cockpit windows of the era, remnants of improvised tools and campfires, and perhaps most famously, a woman's compact, a zipper pull, and fragments of a shoe resembling the kind Amelia was known to wear. Each discovery fanned the flames of belief that Amelia had landed on the reef and struggled to survive. The geography of Nikomaro fits this possibility. The island's reef, flat, wide, and relatively smooth, could have provided a makeshift landing strip at low tide. If Amelia managed to set the Electra down there, it might have remained intact for a time, offering shelter and supplies. But rising tides and crashing waves would eventually drag the plane into the sea, leaving little visible trace. For survivors stranded on the island, life would have been brutal. Nikomaro offered coconuts, some fish, and little else. Fresh water was scarce, the heat punishing, and isolation absolute. To survive for weeks would have required extraordinary resilience. Supporters of the hypothesis point to anecdotal evidence as well. In the days after Amelia's disappearance, shortwave radio operators across the Pacific, and even in the United States, claimed to have intercepted distress calls. Some described hearing a woman's voice saying she was on land but needed help. If true, these signals might have come from the Electra, still intact on the reef, powered briefly by the engines before fuel ran out completely. To skeptics, the signals were likely atmospheric noise or misinterpretations, but to believers, they were Amelia's final attempts to reach the outside world from her lonely prison. Critics of the Nikomaro theory argue that the evidence is circumstantial at best. Aluminum scraps could have come from other sources. The bones, long since lost, can never be retested. The artifacts, while intriguing, have not definitively been linked to Amelia. Moreover, when the Navy flew over the island in 1937, they saw no plane, no survivors waving for help. If Amelia and Fred were there, why was nothing visible? Perhaps they were hidden by vegetation. Perhaps they were already gone. The questions remain. Yet the theory refuses to die, largely because it offers something the crash and sink theory does not, a narrative of survival. The idea that Amelia Earhart, the world's most famous aviatrix, fought to live on a deserted island, captures the imagination in a way that a silent crash at sea cannot. It places her not as a victim of instant catastrophe, but as a castaway, battling isolation and the elements. In this telling, her disappearance is not just a tragedy, but a testament to endurance. Taya continues to search the island, employing sonar, submersibles, and advanced imaging to hunt for the Electra's remains along the reef slope. Each expedition makes headlines, each new artifact reignites debate, and yet the definitive proof, an engine, a serial number, a photograph, remains elusive. Nikumaroro is a place of whispers, not declarations, a stage where history's greatest mystery teases, but never fully reveals itself. For many, the Nikumaroro hypothesis is Amelia Earhart's most haunting possibility. Perhaps she did not vanish in an instant, but lived for days or weeks, staring out at an empty horizon, waiting for a rescue that never came. Perhaps her final footprints washed away with the tide, her voice lost in static, her plane swallowed by the sea. And perhaps in that lonely survival, she wrote her final chapter not as a legend lost, but as a woman who endured to the very end. When official explanations fall short, the human imagination fills the void. Amelia Earhart's disappearance was too shocking, too incomplete for the world to accept without speculation. The crash and sink theory satisfied the Navy, and the Nikumaroro hypothesis drew the attention of researchers, but countless others were not content. Over the decades, a web of conspiracies and alternative theories has grown around Amelia's fate, some plausible, some far-fetched, and some shaped more by cultural anxieties than by evidence. One of the most persistent is the Japanese capture theory. According to this idea, Amelia and Fred Noonan never perished in the sea. Instead, they were forced to land in the Marshall Islands, then under Japanese control, where they were captured and possibly imprisoned. Supporters argue that the Electra, unable to locate Howland, turned north toward the Marshalls and came down on one of the atolls. Local islanders later told stories of a white woman and tall white man held by the Japanese, fueling speculation that Amelia and Fred had become prisoners of war years before World War II officially began. Some versions of this theory claim Amelia was suspected of being an American spy, using her flight as cover to survey Japanese installations. At the time, tensions in the Pacific were rising, and suspicions ran high. If true, Amelia may have become an unwilling pawn in a larger geopolitical game. Decades later, Marshallese elders recounted tales of an American woman flung into prison, and in 1944, US servicemen on Saipan claimed to have heard rumors of Earhart's captivity there. A photograph surfaced in the 2010s, allegedly showing Amelia and Fred among a crowd in the Marshall Islands, but experts quickly debunked it, proving the image predated her disappearance. Still, the Japanese capture theory endures, fed by oral histories and Cold War suspicions. Another variation spins the tale darker, that Amelia was executed by Japanese forces, her body buried in secret. Some conspiracy theorists suggest the US government knew but suppressed the truth to avoid international scandal on the eve of war. For those who distrust official narratives, this theory fits neatly into a worldview where governments hide uncomfortable realities and heroes vanish into classified files. Closely tied to the capture theory is the spy mission hypothesis. Some have claimed Amelia Earhart's world flight was never just about records or exploration. Instead, they argue, she was working covertly for the US government, tasked with photographing Japanese bases in the Pacific, under the guise of adventure. The timing, just 2 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor, lends the story a cloak of intrigue. Yet historians generally dismiss the idea, pointing out there is no credible evidence of such a mission. Earhart's fame made her too visible to serve as a spy. If secrecy was the goal, she was the worst candidate imaginable. Still, the idea persists, fueled by novels, films, and the public's love of espionage tales. Then there is the Tokyo Rose connection, a post-war legend that claimed Amelia survived, and later became one of the infamous Tokyo Rose broadcasters, English-speaking women who spread Japanese propaganda to demoralize Allied troops. In reality, Tokyo Rose was a composite term applied to multiple women, none of whom were Amelia Earhart. The idea that America's beloved aviatrix could have ended up as a propaganda mouthpiece was sensational, but entirely unfounded. Yet, in times of war, stories take on lives of their own, merging fear with imagination until fact and fiction blur. Another conspiracy theory suggests Amelia returned to the United States under a new identity. Some claimed she became a woman named Irene Bolam, a New Jersey banker who bore a passing resemblance to the aviatrix. In 1970, A book even alleged that Bolam was Earhart in hiding, sparking lawsuits and controversy. Bolam herself publicly denied the claim, stating flatly that she was not Amelia Earhart. Subsequent investigations confirmed her identity as Irene Bolam, and the theory was dismissed as baseless. Still, it showed the lengths to which people would go to keep Amelia alive in their minds. Why do these conspiracies persist? In part because Amelia Earhart was more than a pilot. She was a symbol. Symbols resist ordinary endings. To accept that she simply ran out of fuel and fell into the sea feels unsatisfying, anticlimactic, even insulting to her legend. Conspiracies offer something more: drama, intrigue, survival against odds, or even secret lives. They transform Amelia from a victim of chance into a figure entangled in the great narratives of the 20th century: war, espionage, betrayal, and cover-ups. Of course, the lack of evidence cuts both ways. Without wreckage, without remains, the truth of Amelia's fate remains open to interpretation. Each theory, no matter how unlikely, has room to grow because the Pacific keeps its secrets well. For some, it is easier to imagine her alive in a Japanese prison or living under a new name than to confront the image of her plane sinking silently beneath the waves. Yet, conspiracies also reflect something deeper about Amelia's place in history. She was not just a pilot, but a cultural icon whose life intersected with issues of gender, technology, and international politics. Her disappearance became a canvas onto which society projected its fears and fascinations. Whether imagined as a spy, a captive, or a hidden survivor, Amelia became more than a person. She became a story. In the end, conspiracies may reveal more about us than about her. We crave resolution, and in its absence, we build myths. Amelia Earhart, lost in 1937, continues to live precisely because she was never found, and in the shadows of history, she remains both fact and fiction, reality and legend. The mystery of Amelia Earhart's disappearance has lingered for nearly 9 decades, but perhaps the greater truth lies not in how she died, but in how she lived. For Amelia was never just a pilot. She was a pioneer, an icon, and a voice that spoke to generations about courage, ambition, and possibility. The legacy she left behind endures not because of the unanswered questions, but because of the undeniable impact she had on aviation, women's rights, and the human spirit itself. When Amelia Earhart vanished in 1937, she was already a global celebrity. Newspapers had followed her every flight, her every word. Children clipped her photographs from magazines and pasted them in scrapbooks. To the world, she was proof that modern aviation could shrink continents and connect cultures, but she was also proof that women could rise to heights. Society had long denied them. At a time when women in America were still fighting for equality in the workplace, Amelia soared above limitations. She showed that daring was not the exclusive right of men. Her every achievement was a challenge to the idea that women belonged only in the home. Her influence extended far beyond aviation. As a public speaker, writer, and advocate, she inspired countless women to step into roles that had seemed impossible. She co-founded the 99s, an international organization of women pilots that continues to this day. She lent her voice to campaigns for gender equality, insisting that women had the right to careers, to independence, and to dreams. In an era when advertisements told women their value was in keeping house, Amelia told them to look to the skies. She became a symbol of progress, not only in aviation, but in the broader fight for women's liberation. Her disappearance only magnified her legend, because Amelia's end was never found. She became timeless. Unlike Lindbergh, who lived into old age, Amelia froze forever in the public imagination, young, daring, and fearless. The unanswered questions surrounding her fate turned her into a myth, a mystery that kept her name alive in a way few public figures achieve. Every new theory, every expedition, every headline about a scrap of aluminum on a Pacific atoll keeps her spirit in conversation with the present. It is as though Amelia never left the skies, still circling somewhere above us, waiting to be found. The cultural fascination with Amelia Earhart has spanned books, documentaries, films, and songs. She has been immortalized in statues, postage stamps, and museum exhibits. Her story is taught in schools as a lesson not only in aviation, but in perseverance. For young women in particular, Amelia remains an enduring role model. She was not flawless. She knew the risks of her flights. She sometimes downplayed failures, and she was savvy about her own celebrity. But these qualities make her human, and her humanity makes her achievements all the more inspiring. Technological advances continue to seek answers to the mystery. Oceanographic teams have launched expeditions using sonar, submersibles, and deep-sea drones to scan the Pacific seabed. Researchers have studied bones, artifacts, and radio logs with modern tools. Each time, headlines resurface, the final answer to Amelia's mystery. Yet the ocean has remained silent. Whether her Electra lies deep beneath the waves near Howland, or whether fragments of her story linger on Nicomaro, the conclusive truth remains out of reach. And perhaps that is why her legacy endures so powerfully. Amelia Earhart is not a closed chapter. She is an open question. But Amelia's legacy is not confined to her disappearance. It is in the lives of those she touched, the barriers she shattered, and the path she cleared. Every woman who steps into a cockpit, every pilot who dares a dangerous route, every person who chooses ambition over fear walks, in some sense, in her footsteps. Amelia herself once said, "The most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is merely tenacity." Those words, simple and unassuming, capture the essence of her life. She acted, again and again, when others hesitated. She dared, even knowing the risks. She leapt, and in leaping, she taught the world that flight is not just about machines, it is about courage. Even today, Amelia's image remains vibrant. The leather jacket, the wind-swept hair, the half-smile that hinted at both confidence and mischief. She is not remembered as a tragic figure, but as a luminous one. Her disappearance was not a failure but the final spark that sealed her place in legend. For if she had returned safely, she would have been celebrated in her time, but perhaps forgotten in ours. Instead, Amelia Earhart remains a presence, half history, half myth, forever lost, yet never gone. In the end, Amelia Earhart's story is not just about loss, it is about what remains the dream of flight, the courage to defy convention, and the reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but cherished. She may have vanished into the Pacific skies, but her spirit continues to fly, unbound by time or place. Amelia Earhart's true landing place is not on Howland, nor Nicomaro, nor beneath the sea. It is in the imagination of everyone who has ever looked upward and wondered what it would be like to soar.